This is lecture number 65, our second lecture on World War I. Today we're talking about the home front, and the major theme that we're looking at is migration and settlement. There is one learning objective, that is explain the causes and effects of international and internal migration patterns over time. So for the first key concept, we are looking at official restrictions on freedom of speech grew during World War I as increased anxiety about radicalism led to a Red Scare and attacks on labor activism and immigrant culture. So during World War I, Congress passes the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act in 1917 and 1918. And they're trying to restrict the opposition to the war, or the public opposition to the war. Now, this is a little ironic because Woodrow Wilson is supposedly a progressive president, one that would try to uphold civil liberties, but he signs these into law. And the two laws are strengthened further by the Supreme Court case Schenck versus the United States in 1919. This court case establishes that free speech can be limited by the government as long as it presents a clear and present danger. The Supreme Court's justices likened this to screaming fire in a crowded theater. Obviously, that would put a lot of people in danger. You can't just go around into theaters and yelling fire. But of course, in 2021, you can't go into theaters at all because of the pandemic. Eugene V. Debs, the socialist labor leader from the previous period that we talked about, involved in the Pullman strike, ran for president during this time in 1916, and he was also imprisoned due to breaking or violating the Sedition Act, and then will later run for president from jail. So the Red Scare at the end of the war was fueled by anti-communism. So the anti-German nativism turned into anti-communism. This was a fear that something like what happened in the Soviet Union would happen in the United States, where the government is overthrown and communism is put in place. Because of this Red Scare, unions were seen as dangerous, and so therefore union membership declined in the 1920s. And there is an effort by the government, led by J. Edgar Hoover, to arrest anyone who may be a radical. So this is in the Palmer raids. They arrest 6,000 people, mostly of foreign birth or foreign ancestry. And you can see in the bottom right, so those who were immigrants to the United States are being sent back to the country from which they came. A lot of them were arrested without really any strong evidence against them. It was mostly fueled by xenophobia and fear of foreigners. All right, so immigration from Europe reached its peak in the years before World War I. During World War I, nativist campaigns against some ethnic groups led to the passage of quotas that restricted immigration, particularly from the southern and eastern Europe regions, and increased barriers to Asian immigration. So during the war, nativists took advantage of the fear of foreigners and got the 1917 Immigration Act passed. This creates a barred zone from the Middle East to Southeast Asia. This is a new region from which people cannot immigrate to the United States. On the map, you see that it includes all of India, or modern-day India, Afghanistan, parts of China, all of Southeast Asia, so Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia. They are no longer able to come to the United States, and Japan as well. By this time, they are not allowed to send people to the United States. In addition to this, it includes a clause for literacy tests, so anyone coming to the United States must be able to read, whether it be in English or in their home country. The literacy test was something that nativists were pushing for all the way back to the 1890s. Grover Cleveland was one of the first presidents that vetoed a piece of legislation that had a literacy test attached to it. Now, nativism continued to grow, and a lot of this had to do with the propaganda that was being put out in order to support the war effort. The Committee on Public Information was led by George Creel to increase support for the war. You can see what the different posters looked like. They would racialize the enemy to make them seem inferior to Americans, and so therefore making it easier for Americans to oppose them. On the poster on the bottom left, you see that they're being called mad brutes. likened to a chimpanzee attacking an innocent woman who is supposed to be America. In the middle, you see the Germans being referred to as Huns, looking kind of sinister with blood on their hands. And George Creel utilized the 4-minute men. So these were people that were sent all across the country that would give 4-minute speeches in favor of the war. The reason why they're called 4-minute men is because their speeches were 4 minutes, which was the same amount of time that it took for someone in a movie theater to change reels. So that's where most of these 4-minute men would be giving their speeches, is in movie theaters where they're watching films. All right, we have an increased demand for war production and labor during World War I. This leads to many Americans migrating to urban centers in search of economic opportunities. During the war, the United States takes control of the economy. Since this is total war, all of the resources are being devoted to help win the war. We centralize the economy with the War Industries Board to direct industrial production. The Railroad Administration makes sure that the railroads are all able to transport the military material to where it needs to be as fast as possible. And because the government takes control of all these different railroad lines, there's a growth in standardization of railroad equipment, whether that be gauges or actual technology on the railroads. The Food Administration at this point is actually led by a future president, Herbert Hoover, and they're encouraging people to grow their own food or have a small garden called Liberty Gardens. The National War Labor Board will arbitrate labor disputes between unions and businesses, usually trying to get a fair deal for both, but obviously they're going to more likely side with business because they need these factories to continue to stay open and produce the war materials. So the United States passes the Selective Service Act in 1917, and it establishes what ends up being the draft. 2.8 million people are called that are ages 21 to 35, and then later the ages get expanded to 18 to 45. Because there's so many soldiers that are going off to war, now there's new opportunities for women, African Americans, and Mexican immigrants to take jobs in factories or other heavy industries or war material production, because all of the men that previously had those jobs or would have worked those jobs will be fighting in the war. And finally, the 1920 census is the first time in which more people are living in urban areas versus rural areas. So you see the true effect of this mobilization and industrialization. Now, the 1920 census defines an urban area as any place that has more than 2,500 people living inside of it. By our standards, 2,500 people living in one place is rather small, but for the times proportionate to the number of people in the United States, this was a big push or a big move towards urbanization. All right, so now we have the Great Migration. In the Great Migration, during and after World War I, African Americans escaping segregation, racial violence, and limited economic opportunity in the South moved to the North and West, where they found new opportunities but still encountered discrimination. So the map on the left side you see will be the first Great Migration. All of the bluish circles show an area in which the population of African Americans is decreasing, and all of the orange and yellow circles show where African American populations are increasing. And the population of the African Americans in the North, Midwest, and the West nearly triples during this time period. There are new opportunities, so escaping sharecropping in the South, that's important, and there is higher paying factory work for them. This is going to lay the foundation down for what will become the Harlem Renaissance. African Americans who move from different parts of the country and all settling in this case, one part of New York City in the Harlem neighborhood. Now, when they get to these new areas, there is still discrimination and violence. So the KKK is active in the Midwest still. And you can see from the picture here that they would burn crosses to try and intimidate the new African Americans that are coming into the city. Now, there were also race riots, and the most serious one was the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921. And this started because the black Americans in Tulsa were trying to stop a lynching from happening. And when they prevented it from happening, the white population of Tulsa ended up attacking the black part of town called Black Wall Street. It was called Black Wall Street because in this community in Tulsa, the black community was rather economically prosperous. They had done pretty well for themselves. And the end of that lynching turned out to be detrimental for the rest of the community because houses were burnt, businesses were burnt down, people were attacked, and while the amounts of people who were killed as a result of the race riot is disputed, the estimates go from 75 to 300. And in order to celebrate the destruction of Black Wall Street, the white Tulsans ended up creating postcards like the one that you see on the screen now of someone who was burnt alive as a result of the race riot. There were many other examples of these where they would put different pictures on them of the houses burning, of people being, or of dead bodies being put on trucks in order to transport them out. So despite the new opportunities that were being presented as a result of the Great Migration, discrimination was still there, Jim Crow laws were still there, and racial violence was still there for African Americans in the first half of the 20th century. All right, so what else happened? The learning objectives and the key concepts of this unit tend to leave a couple of things out. And so during the war, we also deal with a worldwide pandemic. That's the 1918 pandemic, also referred to as the Spanish flu pandemic, even though the source of the virus was likely coming from the United States in a U.S. military camp, and then transported to Europe and again transported back. Now, the virus that was going around then was actually an H1N1 influenza virus. This is also sometimes referred to as the swine flu. It's the same type of virus that erupted into a smaller version of the pandemic in 2009. In 1918, it killed about 500,000 Americans. And if you're comparing that with the current pandemic, we're up to about 460,000 Americans who have died of COVID-19. In 1919, there's also nationwide strikes. One of the biggest ones is in the Seattle area, where up to 50,000 people go on strike and stop working. It starts with dockyard workers. But this is an example of how, despite the unity that was created through fighting World War I, there are still many economic issues that are present in the United States. And then finally, the decline of progressivism. So this is putting a check mark or a bookend to the era that we've been studying thus far. A lot of it has to do with World War I. We have a very destructive and, in the end, pointless war that killed the progressive spirit. All of the progressive goals that Woodrow Wilson went into the Treaty of Versailles negotiations with did not really get adopted, and the United States does not enter into the League of Nations. And so therefore this new prosperous and peaceful world in which things are solved diplomatically through a supranational organization does not exist for us. And then finally, in 1919, Teddy Roosevelt, who was associated with progressivism in the Republican Party, also dies. So the two Republican presidents that we'll see, or the three Republican presidents that we'll see in the next 12 years, are going to veer away from that brand of Republican politics, and they're going to be a lot more conservative. All right, and finally our recap. So civil liberties and free speech were restricted to support the war. So that's the Espionage Act and the Schenck ruling by the Supreme Court. The Red Scare arose out of fears of communism spreading. Nativism was exacerbated by World War I. We can see this in the 1917 Immigration Act, which restricted immigration from Asian countries. Labor and war demands drew people to cities and industrial centers, and finally, African Americans moved out of the South, yet they still experienced hardship along with new opportunities. All right, well, thank you for watching this lecture. Please come back for lecture number 66, in which we start talking about the 1920s. Thank you, and we'll see you then.